The maintenance supervisor at Fort Bragg's Aviation Support Facility looked at Chief Warrant Officer Chen with the expression of someone delivering a death sentence. The storm system approaching the Carolina coast had already grounded every aircraft on the base, and the meteorological reports suggested conditions that would keep them earthbound for the next 48 hours. "Chen, I know you've been cleared for the most challenging missions, but what they're asking for tonight goes beyond anything in the operational manual," Supervisor Jack Rodriguez said, studying weather data that painted a picture of atmospheric violence. Sustained winds at 70 knots, zero visibility, and electrical activity that's already knocked out 3 communication towers. Maya examined the mission briefing that had arrived 20 minutes earlier through channels reserved for the most urgent operations. A Navy SEAL team conducting reconnaissance along the Syrian coast had encountered hostile forces in numbers far exceeding intelligence estimates. Their extraction helicopter had been shot down during the initial rescue attempt. Now 8 operators were trapped on a mountainside, surrounded by enemy forces, with no conventional means of reaching them before dawn brought reinforcements that would make rescue impossible. "The other pilots won't even discuss it," Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many good people accept missions that claimed their lives. "Flight conditions exceed every safety parameter we've established. The storm system is generating microbursts that could bring down an aircraft before the pilot knows what hit them." Maya studied meteorological data that would have caused most aviators to ground themselves without question. The approaching tempest was a convergence of systems that created atmospheric conditions resembling nature's attempt to prevent flight. But the mission parameters were clear, and the alternatives were unacceptable. "What about the SEAL team?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the urgency in the mission briefing. 8 operators pinned down by superior numbers. Their communication equipment is damaged, ammunition is running low, and intelligence suggests enemy reinforcements will arrive by sunrise. Rodriguez paused, studying Maya's expression for any sign that she understood the magnitude of what was being requested. "If they're not extracted within the next 4 hours, we'll be planning a recovery operation instead of a rescue mission." The words carried implications that extended beyond tactical failure. These weren't just numbers on an operational report. They were people who'd accepted risks to protect interests that most Americans would never know were threatened. Their families would receive folded flags and carefully worded explanations that revealed nothing about missions that officially didn't exist. Maya had earned her reputation flying missions that other pilots considered impossible. Her Black Hawk had extracted wounded personnel from landing zones under direct fire. She'd navigated through weather conditions that grounded entire squadrons. Her precision flying had saved lives in situations where conventional approaches would have guaranteed casualties. But what Command was requesting tonight pushed beyond the boundaries of everything she'd accomplished before. "Ma'am," came a voice from the doorway. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few pilots Maya respected enough to consider a peer, entered the briefing room with an expression that suggested she'd been monitoring the developing situation. "I've been reviewing the meteorological data and flight path requirements. The storm system is generating conditions that exceed our aircraft's operational limitations." She gestured toward displays showing wind patterns that resembled abstract art painted by a psychotic meteorologist. "Microbursts are forming and dissipating every few minutes. Visibility is approaching zero, and the electrical activity could interfere with navigation systems in ways that would leave us flying blind through mountains." Maya studied the flight path that would take her Black Hawk through 200 miles of hostile territory during the worst storm the region had experienced in decades. The route required flying at altitudes that would expose them to ground fire while navigating terrain that offered no margin for error. "What's the crew situation?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer from the urgency in the mission briefing. Flight Engineer Davis and Gunner Thompson volunteered. Both understand the risks, but they also know that SEAL team has no other options. Staff Sergeant Mike Davis had been Maya's flight engineer for 3 years. His technical expertise had kept their aircraft operational during missions that pushed equipment beyond designed limitations. Sergeant First Class Alex Thompson was a door gunner whose accuracy had provided covering fire that allowed countless extractions under hostile conditions. But Maya also understood that accepting this assignment meant risking 3 lives to save 8. command calculations that weighed acceptable losses against mission importance, the mathematics of warfare that reduced human beings to variables in equations that determined who lived and who died. Time frame? She asked, checking her watch against sunset schedules that would determine when they'd be flying through mountainous terrain in complete darkness. Wheels up in 30 minutes if you accept. The storm system is moving faster than originally predicted. If we wait any longer, weather conditions will make flight impossible even for someone with your capabilities.
Maya looked at meteorological displays that painted a picture of atmospheric violence approaching biblical proportions. Wind shear patterns that could tear an aircraft apart, electrical activity that could disable systems critical for navigation, and visibility conditions that would make flying equivalent to high-speed navigation while blindfolded. Her Black Hawk sat on the tarmac outside, its rotor secured against wind gusts that were already testing the aircraft's structural limits. The machine represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology, designed to function in environments where conventional aircraft would fail. But even advanced engineering had limitations when confronted with nature's most violent displays. "I'll need full weather updates every 10 minutes during flight," Maya said, her words confirming acceptance of a mission that most pilots would have declined without consideration. "Real-time intelligence on enemy positions, and I want confirmation that the SEAL team can maintain their position until we reach extraction coordinates." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested he understood the slim margins that separated mission success from catastrophic failure. "All available resources will be dedicated to support. This has priority over every other operation in the theater." Maya began pre-flight preparations that would determine whether her aircraft could function in conditions that pushed beyond every operational parameter. She checked redundant systems that might be needed if primary equipment failed, verified communication protocols that could penetrate electromagnetic interference generated by the storm, and reviewed emergency procedures for situations that might develop during flight through hostile territory. Staff Sergeant Davis joined her at the aircraft, his expression reflecting the combination of professional confidence and personal concern that characterized people preparing for missions where survival wasn't guaranteed. "Ma'am, I've completed full systems checks. Everything's functioning within normal parameters, but the environmental conditions we're heading into could affect performance in ways we can't predict." Davis had maintained their Black Hawk through missions that subjected aircraft to stresses that exceeded manufacturers' specifications. His technical expertise had identified potential problems before they became critical failures. If he expressed concerns about equipment performance, Maya took them seriously. "Primary systems look good, but I've prepared backup solutions for navigation, communication, and power distribution. If the storm affects our primary equipment, we'll have alternatives that could keep us operational long enough to complete extraction." Sergeant Thompson was securing equipment that could be needed if their rescue mission became a combat operation. His door guns were loaded with ammunition designed to penetrate body armor. Communication systems were tested and verified. Medical supplies were arranged for quick access if the SEAL team had sustained casualties during their encounter with hostile forces. "Ma'am, intelligence reports suggest the enemy forces surrounding our people include technical specialists with anti-aircraft capabilities. We might be flying into more than just weather problems." The combination of atmospheric violence and hostile fire represented challenges that would test every aspect of Maya's flying abilities. She'd have to navigate through storm conditions that could disable her aircraft while avoiding weapons specifically designed to bring down helicopters. Success would require the kind of precision flying that few pilots had ever attempted under such conditions. "Weather update," Rodriguez announced through communication systems that crackled with interference from electrical activity approaching the base. "Storm intensity is increasing faster than predicted. Sustained winds now at 80 knots with gusts approaching 100. If you're going, it has to be now." Maya completed her pre-flight checklist with movements that reflected thousands of hours of training and operational experience. Every switch position was verified. All systems were confirmed operational. Emergency procedures were reviewed one final time. Her crew took positions that would allow them to function effectively during flight through conditions that would challenge their aircraft's capabilities. Tower, this is Angel 6 requesting immediate departure clearance, Maya transmitted, using call signs that identified their mission as priority operation requiring all available support. Angel 6, you are cleared for immediate departure. Winds are 080 at 75 knots, gusting to 95. Visibility is less than 1/4 mile and decreasing. Good luck. The Black Hawk lifted from the tarmac into air that felt like a living thing determined to prevent their flight. Wind gusts buffeted the aircraft with forces that tested Maya's ability to maintain controlled flight. Rain struck the windscreen with impacts that sounded like machine gun fire. Lightning illuminated storm clouds that towered above them like mountains made of violence and electricity. Angel 6, current weather at extraction coordinates shows wind speeds approaching 110 knots. Visibility is near zero. Be advised that landing may not be possible under current conditions. Maya adjusted her flight path to account for wind patterns that changed every few minutes as the storm system continued developing. The aircraft shook with turbulence that felt like flying through an earthquake. Navigation systems flickered as electromagnetic interference from lightning strikes affected electronic equipment throughout the region. "Davis, how are systems holding up?" she asked through internal communication that competed with atmospheric noise trying to overwhelm their equipment.
"Primary navigation is stable, but receiving interference every few minutes," Davis replied, monitoring displays that painted a picture of aircraft performance under conditions that pushed beyond designed limitations. "Communication systems are maintaining contact, but signal strength is decreasing as we move farther from base stations." The flight path took them over terrain that was invisible beneath storm clouds that blocked all external visibility. Maya relied on instruments that translated the world below into electronic representations that hopefully reflected reality accurately enough to prevent controlled flight into mountainous terrain. Each mountain peak became a navigation hazard that had to be avoided using information that could be compromised by electromagnetic interference. "Thompson, any signs of ground activity?" Maya asked, though visibility conditions made visual observation impossible. "Nothing visible, but radar is detecting movement patterns that could be vehicle convoys," Thompson reported. "Can't confirm whether they're hostile or civilian traffic, but the movement suggests organized activity rather than random travel." The intelligence added another layer of complexity to navigation that was already pushing Maya's abilities to their limits. Enemy forces could be moving through the region using the storm as cover for operations designed to reinforce positions around the trapped SEAL team. Her flight path might take them over hostile concentrations that could engage them with anti-aircraft weapons. Lightning struck close enough to illuminate storm clouds that surrounded them like walls of atmospheric violence. The electromagnetic pulse from the strike caused temporary interference with navigation systems that left them flying blind for several seconds before backup equipment restored electronic visibility. "Angel 6, be advised that communication with the SEAL team has been intermittent due to weather conditions," came an update from operations. "Last contact indicated they were still in defensive positions, but ammunition was running low. Enemy activity in the area appears to be increasing." The information meant their extraction window was closing faster than originally calculated. If hostile forces were moving additional personnel into the area, the SEAL team's position could become untenable before Maya could reach them. Time was now measured in minutes rather than hours, and each delay reduced the probability of successful rescue. "ETA to extraction coordinates," Maya asked Davis, who was calculating flight time against weather conditions that affected aircraft performance in ways that couldn't be precisely predicted. "Approximately 45 minutes at current airspeed," Davis replied, "but headwinds are increasing and visibility is getting worse. We might need to reduce speed to maintain safe separation from terrain features." Maya pushed the Black Hawk through atmospheric conditions that would have grounded most aircraft. Wind shear tried to tear the rotors from their housing. Rain and hail struck the fuselage with impacts that felt like incoming artillery, and electromagnetic interference from continuous lightning strikes created navigation challenges that required constant attention to instruments that painted incomplete pictures of their environment. Angel 6, I'm reading fluctuations in engine performance, Maya said, noting indicators that suggested the aircraft's power plants were struggling with atmospheric conditions that affected air density and combustion efficiency. Confirmed, engines are working harder to maintain power in this atmospheric density. Fuel consumption is higher than planned, but we still have sufficient reserves to complete the mission. However, if conditions worsen, we might face decisions about emergency landing sites. The aircraft shuddered through turbulence that felt like flying through a blender operated by someone with anger management issues. Maya's hands ached from maintaining control inputs that kept them in controlled flight rather than allowing atmospheric forces to determine their flight path. Every few minutes, wind shear tried to flip the aircraft into attitudes that would have been unrecoverable at their current altitude. Angel 6, intelligence update, came a transmission that barely penetrated electromagnetic interference. Enemy forces have been detected moving toward the SEAL team's position. Recommend immediate extraction before hostile reinforcements arrive. Maya calculated time and distance against weather conditions that were continuing to deteriorate. The storm system was intensifying faster than meteorologists had predicted. Wind speeds that had been manageable were approaching levels that could make controlled flight impossible. But the alternative was abandoning 8 people to certain death or capture.
Angel 6, you are approaching the extraction area, came a transmission that competed with atmospheric noise for control of their communication frequencies. SEAL team reports they can hear rotors, but visibility is too poor for visual contact with aircraft. Maya began to scent through atmospheric conditions that felt like flying into a washing machine filled with violence. The extraction coordinates were located on a mountainside that offered no margin for error during approach and landing. Wind patterns around the terrain created updrafts and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into rocks before the pilot could react. I have terrain contact, Davis announced, studying displays that painted electronic pictures of ground features obscured by weather conditions. Landing zone appears to be approximately 200 meters northeast of our current position. Maya adjusted course toward coordinates that represented salvation for 8 people whose situation had become desperate during the hours required to reach them. But landing would require precision flying through conditions that could prevent takeoff if wind patterns shifted while they were on the ground. Thompson, do you have visual contact with the SEAL team? Maya asked as they descended toward terrain that remained invisible beyond their windscreen. Negative visual contact, but I'm detecting movement patterns that suggest personnel in defensive positions, Thompson replied. Can't confirm friendly versus hostile, but the positions match intelligence reports about our people. The Black Hawk descended through atmospheric violence that transformed landing into an exercise equivalent to threading needles while riding a mechanical bull during an earthquake. Maya fought wind gusts that tried to push them into terrain features that could destroy the aircraft and kill everyone aboard. Every control input had to anticipate atmospheric forces that changed without warning. Angel 6, SEAL team reports they can see your position lights, came a transmission that offered hope in the form of electronic confirmation that they'd found the people they'd come to save. They are prepared for immediate extraction, but report enemy contact within 500 meters of their position. Maya flared the Black Hawk into landing approach through wind shear that could have torn the rotors from any aircraft not designed for extreme conditions. The landing zone materialized from darkness as altitude decreased and proximity to terrain features provided reference points that instruments translated into electronic representations of reality. Contact left, Thompson announced, his voice cutting through atmospheric noise with urgency that indicated immediate threat. Muzzle flashes approximately 400 meters. Hostile forces engaging our extraction site. Maya realized their rescue mission had become a combat operation conducted during the worst weather conditions she'd ever experienced. They were landing under fire in atmospheric violence that made precision flying nearly impossible. The 8 SEAL operators they'd come to save were about to become targets as enemy forces concentrated fire on the only helicopter brave or foolish enough to attempt extraction during conditions that had grounded every other aircraft in the region. The Black Hawk settled toward terrain that offered salvation and death in equal measure. Maya's hands moved across controls that would either complete the most challenging extraction of her career or create another tragedy that would haunt the Special Operations community for years to come. Touchdown in 30 seconds, Maya announced, preparing for ground operations that would test every aspect of their training under conditions that existed at the intersection of atmospheric violence and combat operations.
The Black Hawk's skids touched Syrian soil with impacts that sent shockwaves through the airframe already stressed by atmospheric violence that showed no signs of diminishing. Maya felt the aircraft settle on terrain that remained invisible beyond her windscreen, trusting instrument readings that painted electronic pictures of a landing zone carved from mountainside rock and determination. "We're down," she announced, through communication systems that crackled with interference from lightning strikes occurring every few seconds. "Thompson, get ready to provide covering fire. Davis, prepare for rapid loading procedures." Muzzle flashes erupted from positions scattered across the mountainside as enemy forces engaged targets they couldn't see clearly through weather conditions that limited visibility to mere yards. Tracer rounds created streaks of light that disappeared into atmospheric chaos, their trajectories distorted by wind gusts that could deflect bullets as easily as aircraft. "Contact 200 meters east," Thompson reported, his door guns already tracking toward sources of hostile fire that appeared as brief flashes in darkness, punctuated by lightning strikes. "Multiple positions engaging with automatic weapons." Maya maintained power settings that kept the Black Hawk ready for immediate departure, while fighting wind gusts that tried to lift the aircraft back into atmospheric violence that could tear rotors from their housing. Each gust required control inputs that prevented the helicopter from becoming airborne before extraction operations were complete. 8 figures materialized from terrain features that had provided concealment during hours of defensive operations against superior numbers. The SEAL team moved with tactical precision despite exhaustion that came from maintaining vigilance while surrounded by enemies whose reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez reached the aircraft first, his uniform torn by rocks and vegetation that had provided cover during firefights that consumed their limited ammunition. Behind him, 7 operators carried wounded teammates whose conditions would determine whether Maya's aircraft could support medical emergencies during flight through atmospheric conditions that challenged even healthy personnel. "We've got 2 urgent casualties," Rodriguez shouted over rotor noise that mixed with wind sounds that resembled freight trains colliding in midair. "Gunshot wounds requiring immediate medical attention." Hospital Corpsman Second Class Jennifer Walsh moved between wounded operators with efficiency that reflected training designed for exactly these circumstances. Her medical equipment remained functional despite exposure to weather conditions that had disabled communications gear and navigation systems throughout the SEAL team's equipment inventory. "Petty Officer Jackson has abdominal trauma requiring surgical intervention within 2 hours, Walsh reported, applying pressure bandages that would maintain blood pressure during extraction flight. "Petty Officer Martinez has extremity wounds that are stabilized but need monitoring for shock development." Maya calculated medical requirements against flight time to facilities equipped for trauma surgery. The nearest military hospital was 90 minutes away, through atmospheric conditions that could extend flight duration indefinitely. Weather delays that seemed manageable for routine transportation became life-threatening when measured against surgical timelines for critical patients. "Davis, how much space do we have for medical treatment during flight?" Maya asked, though she knew the answer would determine whether wounded operators survived extraction that had required risking additional lives to accomplish. "Limited space but sufficient for basic trauma management," Davis replied, securing equipment that could interfere with medical procedures during flight through turbulence that would challenge even experienced medical personnel. "Walsh will be working under conditions that civilian emergency rooms would consider impossible." Hostile fire intensified as enemy forces recognized the brief window available for eliminating targets who'd evaded capture despite overwhelming numerical superiority. Automatic weapons created overlapping fields of fire designed to prevent aircraft departure or destroy the helicopter before it could become airborne. Taking fire from multiple directions, Thompson announced, his door guns engaging positions that appeared as muzzle flashes in darkness, broken only by lightning illumination. Enemy forces are attempting to bracket our position. The SEAL team provided return fire that demonstrated why their reputation extended throughout global special operations communities. Each operator chose targets with precision that maximized effect while conserving ammunition supplies that couldn't be replenished until extraction was complete. Their movement toward the aircraft maintained tactical formations that protected wounded teammates while engaging hostile forces. Senior Chief Petty Officer David Kim reached the Black Hawk carrying equipment that weighed more than most people could lift under normal circumstances. Radio gear, navigation systems, and specialized weapons represented capabilities that couldn't be abandoned for enemy forces to analyze and develop countermeasures against future American operations. Priority equipment secured, Kim reported, loading materials that would provide intelligence about SEAL capabilities if captured by hostile forces. All sensitive items are accounted for and ready for extraction.
Maya monitored engine performance that showed power plants struggling with atmospheric density that affected combustion efficiency in ways that reduced available power for operations that required maximum performance. Fuel consumption exceeded normal parameters, while wind loading stressed mechanical systems beyond design specifications. Engine temperatures are elevated, but within acceptable ranges, Davis reported, watching displays that painted pictures of aircraft systems operating at their limits. We have sufficient power for departure, but extended hover time could create thermal management issues. Lightning struck a ridgeline 500 meters from their position with electromagnetic effects that temporarily disabled communication systems throughout the region. Radio frequencies filled with static that prevented coordination between ground forces and air support that might be attempting to assist extraction operations. Communication systems are experiencing interference, Maya announced, though atmospheric noise made transmission barely audible to crew members inside the same aircraft. We're operating without coordination support until electromagnetic conditions improve. Petty Officer First Class Anthony Martinez limped toward the aircraft, carrying wounds that had been stabilized by Walsh's emergency medical treatment. His movement demonstrated the kind of determination that separated special operations personnel from conventional forces, continuing mission execution despite injuries that would hospitalize most people. Martinez is mobile but requires monitoring for blood loss, Walsh reported, helping wounded operators into aircraft positions that provided medical access during flight operations. Jackson's condition is more serious and could deteriorate rapidly without surgical intervention. Maya faced the kind of command decision that defined aviation careers and determined whether rescue missions became success stories or tragedies remembered by people who understood the costs of special operations. Extended ground time increased medical risks for wounded operators, while exposure to hostile fire threatened everyone aboard the aircraft. All personnel aboard, Rodriguez announced, as the last SEAL operator entered the Black Hawk's cargo compartment, ready for immediate departure. Maya began liftoff procedures that would transition them from ground operations vulnerable to small arms fire toward flight operations threatened by atmospheric violence that showed no signs of diminishing. The aircraft rose from terrain that had provided temporary sanctuary into air that felt like a living entity determined to prevent successful extraction. Departure complete, she announced, though atmospheric turbulence immediately began testing her ability to maintain controlled flight while carrying additional personnel whose movement could affect aircraft balance. Proceeding toward medical facilities. Hostile fire followed their departure with tracer rounds that created light patterns in darkness, punctuated by lightning strikes. Enemy forces continued engaging targets they could hear, but not see clearly through weather conditions that limited visibility, while providing acoustic signatures that revealed aircraft position and flight path. Ground fire is tracking our departure route, Thompson reported, his door guns providing suppressive fire that discouraged enemy accuracy while ammunition supplies lasted. Multiple positions engaging with automatic weapons and possible anti-aircraft systems.
The Black Hawk climbed through atmospheric layers that created different types of turbulence at various altitudes. Wind shear that seemed manageable at ground level became violent enough to stress airframe components at higher elevations, where electromagnetic interference from lightning strikes affected navigation systems critical for terrain avoidance. Davis, navigation systems are showing intermittent contact with ground stations, Maya reported, watching displays flicker with interference that could leave them flying blind through mountainous terrain. We need backup navigation solutions before we lose instrument guidance completely. Davis activated redundant systems that provided alternative navigation through methods that didn't depend on ground-based transmitters vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Satellite navigation remained functional despite atmospheric conditions, though position accuracy was degraded by ionospheric disturbances created by electrical activity throughout the storm system. Backup navigation is operational but showing reduced accuracy, Davis reported. Position estimates have error margins that require increased separation from terrain features during flight through mountainous regions. Walsh worked over wounded operators under conditions that challenged every aspect of medical training designed for battlefield environments. Aircraft movement during turbulence made procedures that required steady hands nearly impossible, while atmospheric pressure changes affected patient physiology in ways that complicated trauma management. Jackson's blood pressure is dropping, Walsh announced, applying treatments that would maintain circulation during flight to medical facilities. He needs surgical intervention as soon as possible, but I can stabilize him for transport duration. Maya calculated flight time against weather conditions that continued deteriorating as the storm system intensified beyond meteorological predictions. Wind speeds that had been manageable were approaching levels that could make controlled flight impossible even for aircraft designed for extreme environmental operations. Current ETA to medical facility is 75 minutes, Maya announced, though turbulence made communication difficult even within the aircraft. Weather conditions may extend flight time depending on wind patterns we encounter during route. The SEAL team arranged themselves within the cargo compartment with efficiency that maximized available space while providing access to Walsh for wounded personnel requiring medical attention. Their movements demonstrated experience with extraction operations conducted under conditions that challenged conventional medical procedures. Team is secure for extended flight operations, Rodriguez reported, though his voice carried exhaustion that came from hours of combat operations followed by extraction through atmospheric conditions that stressed healthy personnel. All personnel are accounted for and ready for transport to medical facilities.
Lightning illuminated storm clouds that towered above them like atmospheric mountains composed of violence and electrical energy. Maya navigated between formations that could generate electromagnetic pulses capable of disabling aircraft systems while creating updrafts and downdrafts that could slam helicopters into terrain without warning. Electromagnetic interference is affecting multiple aircraft systems, Davis reported, monitoring displays that showed electrical activity throughout the region. Communication range is reduced, and navigation accuracy continues degrading as storm intensity increases. Maya adjusted flight altitude to minimize exposure to electrical activity while maintaining sufficient clearance from terrain features that remained invisible beyond their windscreen. Each altitude change created different atmospheric conditions that affected aircraft performance in ways that required constant attention to engine parameters and flight control responses. Engine performance is stable despite atmospheric conditions, Davis continued, though his tone suggested concern about mechanical systems operating beyond normal parameters. Fuel consumption remains higher than standard due to density-altitude effects and increased power requirements for turbulence penetration. The flight path took them over territory controlled by various factions whose allegiances remained unclear to intelligence analysts who'd planned extraction routes based on information that might be days or weeks out of date. Maya relied on navigation systems to avoid population centers while maintaining course toward medical facilities equipped for trauma surgery. Walsh, how are our patients handling flight conditions? Maya asked, though turbulence made checking on medical status challenging while maintaining aircraft control through atmospheric conditions that required constant pilot attention. Jackson remains stable but needs immediate surgical attention upon arrival, Walsh replied, her voice steady despite working conditions that would challenge experienced trauma surgeons. Martinez is improving and should handle extended transport without complications. Atmospheric pressure changes associated with the storm system affected wounded operators in ways that weren't covered in standard medical training for helicopter extraction operations. Walsh adapted treatment procedures to account for physiological effects that developed during flight through weather patterns that created unique medical challenges. Atmospheric pressure variations are affecting patient physiology, Walsh reported, adjusting medical equipment to compensate for atmospheric conditions that influence circulation and respiratory function. Both patients are responding well to treatment modifications, but Jackson needs surgical intervention as soon as possible. Maya pushed the Black Hawk through atmospheric violence that felt like flying through a war zone where the enemy was weather itself. Wind shear tried to flip the aircraft into unrecoverable attitudes, while electromagnetic interference from lightning strikes created navigation uncertainties that required flying by instruments whose accuracy was compromised by atmospheric conditions. Communication with medical facility established, Davis announced, as electromagnetic interference briefly cleared enough to allow radio contact with destination hospitals. They're preparing trauma teams for immediate surgical intervention upon our arrival. The confirmation meant Jackson would receive treatment that could save his life, but only if Maya could maintain flight operations through weather conditions that were continuing to intensify beyond anything in their operational experience. Each minute of flight time brought them closer to medical care while exposing them to atmospheric forces that could prevent arrival entirely. Rodriguez, how is your team handling flight conditions? Maya asked, concerned about SEAL operators whose exhaustion from combat operations could be complicated by motion sickness during turbulent flight through storm systems. Team is secure and managing flight conditions, Rodriguez replied, though fatigue was evident in voices throughout the cargo compartment. Everyone understands the importance of reaching medical facilities for our wounded personnel. Lightning struck close enough to illuminate interior cabin areas with electromagnetic energy that temporarily affected aircraft electrical systems. Navigation displays flickered as power fluctuations stressed circuits designed to function despite electromagnetic interference from various sources, including enemy jamming equipment.
Electrical systems cycling through backup power, Davis reported, watching displays return to normal operation as redundant systems compensated for electromagnetic effects. All critical systems remain operational, but we're operating closer to system limitations than normal parameters allow. Maya maintained flight path through atmospheric conditions that would have grounded most aircraft while calculating fuel consumption against distance remaining to medical facilities. Extended flight time through adverse weather had consumed reserves faster than normal operations, creating constraints that affected available options if additional emergencies developed. Fuel status remains adequate for completion of medical evacuation, Davis reported, though his calculations included minimal reserves for approach delays or weather diversions that could extend flight operations. We're committed to current flight path with limited alternatives if conditions worsen. The storm system continued developing intensity that exceeded meteorological predictions, while geographic features created local weather patterns that added complexity to navigation through terrain that offered no emergency landing sites. Maya flew from one electronic waypoint to the next, trusting instruments whose accuracy was degraded by electromagnetic interference throughout the region. Medical facility reports they have trauma teams standing by for immediate surgical intervention, came a transmission that barely penetrated atmospheric interference. Estimated arrival time confirms they'll be ready to receive critical patients. Maya began descent procedures that would bring them through atmospheric layers where different wind patterns created unique types of turbulence. The medical facility's landing zone was equipped with navigation aids that functioned despite electromagnetic interference. but approach would require flying through weather conditions that challenged aircraft design limitations. Beginning approach to medical facility, Maya announced, initiating procedures that would either complete successful extraction or create additional casualties requiring emergency medical treatment. All personnel prepare for landing operations. The Black Hawk descended through atmospheric violence toward medical facilities where trauma surgeons waited to treat wounds sustained during operations that officially didn't exist. Maya's hands moved across controls with precision developed through years of flying missions that saved lives under conditions that challenged human capabilities and mechanical systems equally. Medical teams are visible at landing zone, Thompson reported, as altitude decreased enough to provide visual contact with ground personnel, despite weather conditions that limited visibility to minimal distances. They're prepared for immediate patient transfer. Maya flared the aircraft into landing approach through wind shear that could have destroyed lesser helicopters, while maintaining control inputs that brought them safely to ground, where medical professionals waited to continue saving lives that special operations had risked everything to preserve. Touchdown complete, she announced, as the Black Hawk settled onto pavement designed for emergency medical operations. Medical teams are responding for immediate patient transfer. Jackson and Martinez were transferred to surgical teams within minutes of landing, their treatment continuing seamlessly from battlefield medicine to hospital care that would determine whether extraction through impossible weather conditions had accomplished its ultimate purpose of bringing everyone home alive.
6 months later, the maintenance bay at Fort Bragg's Aviation Support Facility buzzed with routine activity that seemed impossibly normal after a night that had redefined what Maya Chen thought possible in military aviation. Her Black Hawk sat in the same position where she'd found it before accepting a mission that should have been declined by any pilot with common sense and a healthy respect for weather limitations. Colonel Patricia Armstrong, the base commander, approached with an expression that suggested the meeting wasn't coincidental. Maya had been expecting this conversation since submitting her after-action report that documented flight operations conducted beyond every established safety parameter while achieving mission success that had saved 8 lives. "Chen, walk with me," Colonel Armstrong said, gesturing toward offices that provided privacy for discussions that couldn't be overheard by personnel lacking appropriate security clearances. "We need to talk about that night in Syria." Maya followed the colonel through corridors lined with photographs of aviators whose careers had been defined by missions that pushed beyond conventional limitations. Some had received recognition that honored their contributions to military aviation. Others had paid prices that reminded everyone that courage and skill didn't guarantee survival when confronting forces beyond human control. Colonel Armstrong's office overlooked runways where helicopters trained for missions that might someday require the kind of decision-making that had characterized Maya's extraction of the trapped SEAL team. Through windows that framed aircraft practicing maneuvers in perfect weather conditions, the contrast with that stormy night seemed almost surreal. "Your after-action report makes interesting reading," Colonel Armstrong began, settling behind a desk covered with documents that suggested extensive review of Maya's flight operations. Weather conditions that exceeded aircraft operational limitations, electromagnetic interference that compromised navigation systems, hostile fire during extraction operations, and successful completion of medical evacuation that saved 2 lives requiring immediate surgical intervention. Maya waited for questions that would determine whether her decision to accept an impossible mission would be viewed as exceptional airmanship or dangerous risk-taking that violated established safety protocols. The line between heroism and recklessness was often defined by outcomes rather than decision-making processes, and successful missions could be criticized as easily as they were celebrated. The meteorological data from that night has been reviewed by aviation safety specialists who wanted to understand how any aircraft remained airborne through conditions that grounded every other helicopter in the theater. Colonel Armstrong continued. Their assessment suggests you were flying through weather patterns that could have destroyed your aircraft without warning. The observation was accurate, though it understated the technical challenges that required constant attention to aircraft systems operating at their absolute limits. Maya's equipment had functioned beyond design specifications, while atmospheric conditions tested every component that kept helicopters in controlled flight rather than controlled crashes. Ma'am, the mission parameters were clear. 8 SEAL operators required immediate extraction before enemy reinforcements could eliminate them. Weather conditions were extreme, but the alternatives were unacceptable. Colonel Armstrong consulted reports that documented intelligence assessments, weather analyses, and tactical evaluations of operations that had achieved strategic success through methods that challenged conventional military aviation doctrine. The paperwork painted a complete picture of decision-making that balanced acceptable risk against mission requirements. The SEAL team's commander has submitted recommendations that describe your actions as exceptional airmanship under impossible conditions, the colonel said. Chief Rodriguez specifically noted that extraction wouldn't have been possible without pilot capabilities that exceeded normal training standards. Maya thought about Rodriguez and his team, whose recovery required more than just flying through bad weather. The wounded operators had received medical treatment that stabilized their conditions during flight operations that challenged even experienced trauma specialists. Jackson's surgery had been successful, though his recovery would require months of rehabilitation that might end his special operations career. How were Jackson and Martinez recovering? Maya asked, though medical information about special operations personnel remained classified at levels that limited access to people directly involved in their treatment.
Both operators are responding well to treatment, Colonel Armstrong replied. Jackson required extensive surgery but should achieve full recovery. Martinez has returned to limited duty and expects complete medical clearance within weeks. Their survival is directly attributed to rapid extraction and medical attention provided during flight operations. The information meant Maya's mission had accomplished its ultimate purpose, bringing everyone home alive despite conditions that could have easily claimed additional casualties. But she also understood that success didn't eliminate questions about decision-making processes that had accepted risks exceeding established safety parameters. There are people who believe your actions that night demonstrated exceptional judgment under extreme circumstances, Colonel Armstrong continued. There are others who think accepting such a mission violated safety protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of risks you encountered. Maya had anticipated this evaluation since landing at the medical facility where trauma teams had taken responsibility for operators whose lives had depended on her ability to fly through impossible weather conditions. Military aviation required balancing mission accomplishment against crew safety, and the mathematics didn't always produce clear answers. Ma'am, I evaluated the risks and determined that mission requirements justified accepting weather conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters, Maya said. 8 lives depended on extraction that couldn't be delayed until conditions improved. Colonel Armstrong stood and moved to windows that provided views of flight operations conducted under ideal conditions that seemed almost boring compared to the atmospheric violence Maya had navigated 6 months earlier. Clear skies and calm winds represented the kind of flying that most pilots experienced throughout their careers. Chen, I've been reviewing your service record and performance evaluations from the past 5 years, the colonel said. Your flight hours include missions that other pilots avoided. Your success rate on challenging extractions exceeds anyone else in this command. And your aircraft maintenance records show equipment performance that suggests you understand helicopters better than most people understand their automobiles. Maya waited for conclusions that would determine whether her career would advance based on demonstrated capabilities or stagnate due to safety concerns that questioned her decision-making judgment. Military aviation rewarded success while punishing failures that could have been prevented through more conservative approaches to mission acceptance. The question isn't whether you succeeded that night. The question is whether your success represents capabilities that should be recognized and developed or risk-taking that needs to be controlled through more restrictive operational guidelines. The distinction was critical for Maya's future assignments and the missions she would be allowed to accept. Pilots viewed as exceptional could be assigned to operations that utilized their full capabilities. Those considered dangerous might find themselves limited to routine flights that didn't challenge conventional safety boundaries. 3 weeks later, Maya found herself in Washington, D.C., walking through corridors of the Pentagon that housed offices where decisions were made about military aviation policy and personnel assignments that shaped entire careers. The building's atmosphere carried weight that came from proximity to power that influenced global military operations. Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell's office overlooked courtyard areas where senior military officers discussed strategies that affected operations throughout multiple theaters of conflict. The general's reputation included oversight responsibilities for special operations aviation that supported missions existing at the intersection of conventional military doctrine and activities that officially didn't occur. Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell, please have a seat, General Mitchell said, reviewing documents that painted a comprehensive picture of Maya's aviation career and the night that had brought her to Washington for discussions that would determine her future assignments. Your extraction of the SEAL team has generated considerable attention among people who understand the significance of what you accomplished. Maya had expected this meeting since receiving orders that brought her to Pentagon offices responsible for evaluating personnel whose capabilities exceeded normal military aviation standards. Special operations aviation required pilots willing to accept missions that conventional aviators would decline, and identifying such individuals required assessment processes that extended beyond routine performance evaluations. The weather conditions you encountered that night have been analyzed by meteorological specialists who wanted to understand atmospheric phenomena that challenged aircraft design limitations. Their assessment indicates you were flying through conditions that represented the most violent weather patterns documented in that region during the past decade. The technical analysis confirmed what Maya had experienced firsthand during flight operations that pushed her aircraft beyond every established safety parameter. Atmospheric conditions had created challenges that required improvisation and skill development that couldn't be taught in conventional training programs. Furthermore, your medical evacuation under hostile fire demonstrated tactical flying capabilities that suggest training and experience extending beyond routine military aviation. The combination of weather navigation and combat operations represents skill sets that few pilots possess. Maya understood that her actions were being evaluated as indicators of capabilities that could be utilized for future missions requiring similar combinations of technical expertise and operational judgment. Special operations aviation needed people who could function effectively when conventional approaches were inadequate.
Ma'am, I was trained to complete missions that support personnel requiring extraction under challenging conditions, Maya replied. That night represented extreme circumstances, but the fundamental requirements weren't different from other operations I've conducted. General Mitchell consulted reports that documented Maya's complete aviation career, including missions that remained classified at levels preventing detailed discussion even in Pentagon offices. The paperwork painted pictures of someone whose capabilities exceeded normal training, while demonstrating judgment that balanced mission accomplishment against acceptable risk. Your service record includes operations that most pilots never encountered during entire careers, the general observed. Medical evacuations under fire, equipment recovery from hostile territory, personnel insertion into areas where detection would compromise ongoing missions, and now extraction through weather conditions that should have prevented flight operations entirely. Maya thought about missions that had defined her aviation career, each one building capabilities that culminated in the flight that had brought 8 SEAL operators home alive. The progression hadn't been planned, but experience had prepared her for challenges that required every skill she developed through years of military aviation. The Night Stalker Regiment has submitted a request for your transfer to support special operations missions requiring advanced pilot capabilities, General Mitchell announced. They specifically requested someone whose demonstrated performance under extreme conditions suggests ability to handle operations that conventional aviation can't support. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment represented the pinnacle of military helicopter operations. Night Stalker pilots supported missions that existed in shadows between conventional military operations and activities that officially didn't occur. Assignment to the regiment would mean accepting responsibility for operations that pushed beyond every established limitation. The training program involves training programs designed to develop capabilities that extend beyond conventional military aviation into realms that challenge every assumption about helicopter operations. Mission profiles that require flying techniques not covered in standard pilot training. Equipment operation that utilizes aircraft modifications not found in regular military helicopters, and operational procedures that combine aviation with ground combat in ways that challenge traditional distinctions between air and ground operations. Maya considered opportunities that would utilize her full capabilities while exposing her to risks that exceeded anything she'd encountered during conventional military aviation. Night Stalker operations supported missions where failure could affect international relations, while success might never be publicly acknowledged. The training program begins in 6 weeks and requires a 5-year commitment to special operations aviation. Completion qualifies pilots for missions that most military aviators never hear about, supporting operations that protect American interests through methods that civilian populations don't understand. The decision would define Maya's military career and determine whether her capabilities would be utilized for missions that made maximum use of skills demonstrated during the extraction of the SEAL team. But it would also mean accepting psychological pressures that came with operations where mistakes could have consequences extending far beyond aviation accidents. "I accept the transfer and training assignment," Maya said, understanding that her decision would expose her to challenges that would dwarf the atmospheric violence she'd navigated during the storm extraction. "I want to support missions that utilize my full capabilities." General Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Your decision demonstrates the kind of commitment that special operations aviation requires. The training will be more challenging than anything you've experienced, but your performance that night suggests you possess capabilities that could contribute significantly to mission success in environments where conventional aviation would fail." 2 months later, Maya found herself at an undisclosed location where Night Stalker training programs developed capabilities that extended beyond conventional military aviation into realms that challenge every assumption about helicopter operations. The facility's aircraft looked similar to standard military helicopters, but closer inspection revealed modifications that incorporated technology designed for operations that officially didn't exist. Master Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Santos had overseen Night Stalker training for 8 years, developing programs that transformed experienced military pilots into specialists capable of supporting missions that pushed beyond every established operational boundary. Her reputation included successful completion of operations that would have challenged aviators with decades of experience. "Chen, your extraction of that SEAL team demonstrates capabilities that suggest you understand the difference between flying helicopters and conducting special operations aviation. The question is whether you can develop those capabilities to levels required for missions that make your Syrian extraction look like routine training exercises."
Maya studied aircraft that incorporated modifications she'd never seen on conventional military helicopters. Electronic warfare systems that could penetrate hostile air defenses. Navigation equipment that functioned despite electromagnetic interference from enemy jamming. defensive systems that could defeat missiles specifically designed to destroy helicopters operating in hostile territory. Night Stalker operations require pilots who can think tactically while flying technically, Santos continued. You'll be supporting ground operations conducted by people whose lives depend on precision that leaves no margin for error. Flight paths that deviate by meters can compromise missions that took months to plan and execute. The training program pushed Maya's capabilities beyond everything she'd achieved during conventional military aviation. Low-level navigation through terrain that offered no emergency landing sites. Formation flying during complete darkness using equipment that painted electronic pictures of aircraft separated by distances measured in feet. And combat operations that required engaging ground targets while maintaining flight operations that supported personnel extraction under hostile fire. Night vision systems transformed darkness into green-tinted electronic representations of reality that challenged depth perception while providing navigational information that couldn't be obtained through conventional visual flight techniques. Maya learned to fly using instruments that translated infrared radiation into pictures that revealed terrain features, obstacles, and hostile forces that remained invisible to normal vision. Electronic warfare training will teach you to operate in environments where conventional navigation systems don't function, Chief Warrant Officer David Park explained during sessions that introduced capabilities Maya had never encountered during standard military aviation. Enemy forces will attempt to disable your aircraft using methods that range from electromagnetic interference to weapons specifically designed to destroy helicopters. Maya mastered techniques that allowed flight operations despite jamming systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of missions Night Stalkers were trained to conduct. Alternative navigation using celestial observation, communication through frequencies that penetrated electromagnetic interference, and aircraft operation during system failures that would ground conventional helicopters. Medical evacuation training prepared her for operations that combined trauma treatment with flight procedures conducted under conditions that challenged both aviation and medical capabilities. She learned to coordinate with combat medics whose work required aircraft movements that balanced patient care against mission requirements that couldn't be delayed for medical convenience. Special operations medical evacuation requires understanding that patient treatment continues during flight operations that may include combat maneuvers. Your aircraft becomes a flying emergency room where patient survival depends on pilot capabilities that extend beyond conventional medical evacuation. After 18 months of training that redefined her understanding of helicopter capabilities, Maya graduated from programs that qualified her for operations that existed in classified realms where mission success was measured by objectives that civilian populations would never understand. Her assignment to operational units would expose her to missions that utilized everything she'd learned while demanding improvisation that extended beyond any training scenario. The first operational mission came during a winter night that challenged every technique she'd mastered during Night Stalker training. Intelligence indicated that American personnel required extraction from territory controlled by hostile forces whose capabilities included advanced air defense systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of rescue operation being planned. As Maya's modified Black Hawk lifted into darkness that concealed operations protecting American interests through methods that would never appear in public records, Maya realized that the Syrian extraction had been preparation rather than conclusion. Each mission would build capabilities that pushed beyond previous limitations while serving purposes that justified risks accepted by people willing to operate in the shadows between diplomacy and warfare. The aircraft disappeared into night that held secrets worth protecting and people worth saving, carrying a pilot whose capabilities had been forged during atmospheric violence and refined through training that prepared her for missions where failure meant more than personal disappointment. Some storms test human limits, while others reveal capabilities that exceed everything previously thought possible. Maya Chen had learned to fly through both types, bringing people home from places where conventional aviation feared to operate. Years later, when she sat in offices reviewing young pilots' applications for special operations training, Maya would remember the night when 8 SEAL operators called for help that seemed impossible to provide. Her decision to answer that call had defined not just their survival, but her understanding of why some missions require people willing to fly into hell itself to bring their teammates home. The faded flight suit hanging in her quarters bore no visible decorations that revealed the true extent of her service, but it carried the invisible weight of missions that had pushed beyond every limitation while serving purposes that honored the highest traditions of military aviation. Some achievements were measured in lives saved rather than recognition received, and those were the ones that mattered most when darkness fell and people needed salvation that could only come from the sky. Her story became legend whispered among aviators who understood that certain missions required capabilities extending beyond training manuals and safety regulations into realms where courage met skill in service of causes greater than individual survival. The night she'd flown through biblical weather to extract 8 SEAL operators had become the standard by which impossible missions were measured, and the inspiration for pilots who would face their own storms when duty demanded answers that couldn't be found in any textbook. Maya Chen had learned to emerge from storms carrying people who needed salvation. It was, she discovered, exactly what she was born to do. The end.